every time a black mother or a mother of color um, warns her son to be careful, or be safe, or come home, and or we tell our sons, don't try to be a hero, right? Don't wear that hoodie at night. I have three sons. I tell them, do not. I understand it's the style and all of that, man, but listen, this stuff can get you killed, right? That's trauma. That's my trauma speaking out. I'm scared.
Right.
I'm scared for my child. I'm scared for my son. That mother is scared for her child.
We'll discuss race and how it plays a factor and how we didn't even talk about this topic because we were afraid.
A Black Executive Perspective.
Welcome to a Black Executive Perspective podcast, a safe space where we discuss all matters related to race, especially race in corporate America. I'm your host, Tony Tidbit. You know, when most people think about trauma, they immediately focus on the physical wounds, often treatable with medical interventions. However, what about historical trauma? What does that entail? And how does it impact individuals? Where does it originate? And what signs does it manifest? Furthermore, how can healing be achieved? Today, our guest, Yusuf Malik Frederick, will delve into the concept of historical trauma, exploring its origins, effects, and the importance of educating ourselves about it. Yusuf Malik Frederick holds a Juris Doctorate degree in law and postgraduate degree in trauma psychology. He earned his Bachelor's of Arts in Theology and History and spent his early years in the field addressing such common themes as depression, sadness, marriage and family issues, bereavement, and substance abuse, to name a few. Currently, Malik is finishing up his Ph.D. in trauma psychology, where he focuses on multicultural psychology, historical trauma, and resilience, intergenerational trauma as well. Malik is married with a blended family and currently resides in New Jersey. Malik Frederick, welcome to a Black Executive Perspective, my brother.
Thank you, Tony. Man, you make me sound like I'm a pretty decent guy. I appreciate that. Thank you so much. I'm looking forward for my wife. She generally tunes in to you anyway. This is a family event for us. And when she hears this introduction, she's going to have to take me out to dinner because you're making me look. Thank you.
So this right here will back you up when you've been telling her you've been the man all along.
Listen,
right
this,
now you have some something on the record that proves
yeah,
that.
this will make me the man pots and pan.
Hey, you know what? It's interesting for the people here. I've been able to be in the presence of Malik before, and what I want to let you guys know is has to be one of the most humble individuals. Now, like it's the great thing about us and our people is sometimes you get around people and they just themselves genuinely, and you don't realize this brother got everything but a Heisman Trophy and a Navy SEALs Golden Glove championship, and and when you get the chance to get exposed to him, you realize he can really break things down. Because I had no idea until I got this rundown that he has so many letters behind his name and notches on his belt, and that just makes me more excited because I always thought he was a great person, a great speaker, a stand-up brother. Before I knew that he had all these, universities behind him, you know what I'm saying, going with him. So that's a wonderful, wonderful thing, and I'm glad to be in your presence again, brother.
Oh my God, fellas, the check is in the mail for both of you. Thank you. Thank you so much.
So before we get too deep into other things, just give me a little more about where you currently are. Tell me a little more about your family, your background, things of that nature.
Well, currently I am in Princeton, New Jersey, where I live with my wife, and all the kids are out the house, thank God. But I am originally from the Caribbean. My family is from Trinidad and Tobago, and migrated to the land of opportunity, to New York, early on in my childhood. So my early education was in New York. My upbringing was in Queens, New York. And my late teenage years, college, and so forth, was actually down south. I went to school in Huntsville, Alabama. So left New York, went to Alabama, went to law school in Atlanta, lived in Atlanta for quite some time, and back up here in the Northeast. This is where I'm from. I love it here. I can't do no winters, so I've got to be in a place that snows.
Got it. Got it. And look, buddy, that's awesome, right? You know, and you, although you're, international, you are New York through and through. Okay. I mean, I can't even get you to come to Connecticut.
Yeah,
Okay. The
guilty,
dude's like,
guilty.
no, Tony, you know what I'm saying? You got to come to the city. I'm in Jersey, but I'll meet you in the city, but I ain't coming to Connecticut. All right. Which I love. But let me ask you this, my brother. Um, and you have a very accomplished background, right? And we're going to dive, we touched the surface on what you're doing, what your accomplishments are, and we're going to dive into in terms of what you want to talk about today. But the question I have for you is, why were you looking? I know you said it's a family event. I know you guys listen. Your wife listens a lot. But why did you want to come on the Black Executive Perspective podcast?
Well, number one, it's the only show of its kind that I'm aware of on the airwaves. The ratings are AAA plus. Um, there's a wide audience, and Tony, I knew you when you first got started. So these, now you big time, and the show has gone viral and all of that. But I knew you when you were an executive and still are
Hmm.
at on the job, and you would hold
Hmm.
these forums at work in a corporate atmosphere. I've been a fan since then. I'm still a fan. I think that this dialogue is needed in the country, in the community, at a very um, community neighborhood level, because the conversation has to get going, right? In order
Hmm.
to expand understanding and to illuminate misunderstandings and clarify some things, we need to have honest conversations. And one of the places where these kinds of conversations are very uncommon is probably one of the premier places that they need to happen more, and that's within the workspace. And at your level as a Black executive, as a person of color, um, and with the information that you used to bring on the job, and what you continue to bring now to the public as you have expanded your audience, is just great. And I appreciate this invitation. I want to make a contribution to the overall contributions that you have made. And I think this is very necessary. And so I'm just an overall fan. I think you have really carved out a niche that is really essential. And I wish you Godspeed, brother.
Well, thank you, my man. I really appreciate that.
Let me congratulate you on something, Malik, though. Tony is notorious for saying, don't believe me, don't listen to me. Go check for yourself. Go see for yourself. Check the data. Go to the web, go to whatever
Yeah,
sources you need to go to, because this is the truth
yeah,
that I'm spitting. You are here to
yeah.
set the record straight on something Tony has said. So you're the inaugural, rebutter to something that, so you set the trend here. So what did you have to give Tony some grief about that he had said before?
Yeah, well, I listened
Hmm.
to the show, as I said,
Right.
and my wife and I was listening to a show a few weeks ago, and I don't remember the actual theme of the show,
I think it was
It
woke. What
it
is woke and why is it a
it
bad
was
thing?
woke, and and the show was fine. The information was fine generally. And then Tony said something. He said, "Well, you know, when we came here as slaves, we were uneducated." And I was like, "Whoa, what do you mean? Like, who are you talking about? We were uneducated." I was like, "We came here from Africa uh, in around on or about 1619. And when we landed in Jamestown, Virginia, we certainly weren't uneducated. I mean, we left Timbuktu on the west coast of Africa. At that point, it was the one of the first, the largest, most profound universities in the world, right? This country didn't even have a university when Africans came here. So we certainly were not uneducated. We were very educated. Most of the West African slaves and slaves from that region were Muslim, and they spoke Arabic, and they didn't speak English. And so the fact that they didn't speak English doesn't didn't make them uneducated. And so Tony, if the three of us go to Russia today, that wouldn't make us uneducated if we land there and can't speak Russian. But
Buddy,
so
you're
so I
100%
was
right.
like, yo, this is not correct. So I've got to call out Tony on that. I mean, we didn't know English, granted that, but um, what does it mean to really know English? English is not an original language anyway. It's borrowed language
Right.
from, English is a mutt when it comes to languages, right? It's a hodgepodge of, Arabic and Latin and all these other languages, but we certainly didn't need to know English when we landed on these shores. So,
So just so the audience knows, right? And I told Malik because he's being kind of soft here because he's on the show, so he's trying to show some type of respect. But the dude called me, okay, after he listened to the show. He was like, matter of fact, he texted me, "Can you chat?" I was like, "Oh, okay, I can chat, yeah." And he was like, "Look, man, I just listened to your show. It was really educational. I mean, the stuff you were throwing out, yeah, Paul Revere could have been woke. I mean, you were really killing it." He said, "But I gotta take you to task on one thing." And I'm like, "Okay, what?" He said, "We was not uneducated when we came here to the United States." All right. And I was like, "Oh, and listen, I appreciate that, right? That's what this is about. Although I host this is a platform we put together, but I never ever will say that I know all. I'm here and I learn from that's why our guests are very important because I've learned from you, Malik, in a lot of our sessions when we at work. Chris, I've learned from him. And a lot of our guests that come on this show, I've learned from them. So, but more importantly, I wanted you to be able, when you stated that you wanted to come on and talk about historical trauma, I wanted you to be able to have the opportunity to take me to the woodshed publicly, okay? Which is not a bad thing because guess what? We're all here to learn, right? And at the end of the day, you correcting me or providing me more insight on things like that is only going to help me become better in understanding our whole history and which is going to help me amplify it to our audience who watches or listens to us on a
well, I
weekly
mean, in your
basis.
defense, Tony, I think it was a Freudian slip. I mean,
Look,
This
I
dude.
don't really make a big deal about it, but I did, the word uneducated was just a little too strong for me. So
I was
Yeah,
I
I
had
I
to
get
was
it.
so
call out.
glad you got caught up on that and not taking him to the woodshed on using the term came because came seems like a voluntary action as opposed to being brought, right?
Yeah,
Instead
yeah,
of being
yeah,
brought,
yeah, yeah,
right? So
yeah,
that I was like, wow,
yeah,
that's pretty
That's
good. But
fair.
it's interesting that you
yeah.
say that because Albert Einstein has a famous quote where he says, "If you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, then the fish will die thinking it was stupid."
Yes,
So so
yes.
the fact is you only know what you know when you know it, and we did a great job of educating ourselves thereafter against the will of the ecosystem, and we're here now. So I'm excited about that. But I'm excited about today with you and wondering what is trauma? Because I thought like Tony said, I always associated trauma with the physical acumen of a traumatic experience, the trauma ward at the hospital, things of that nature. And you are giving a perspective that I had never really leaned into. And so I just want to ask you on behalf of the folks, what is trauma?
Well, there is a physical aspect to trauma, and there is physical trauma, as you have mentioned just now, like if a person gets shot or something like that. But psychologically, we are talking about psychological and emotional trauma. Emotional trauma and psychological trauma occurs when an individual experiences an event that is beyond their uh, coping capability or coping capacity, right? Their emotions have gone into overload or overdrive, or survival mode, and it's the mode that it gets into biologically or psychologically or emotionally. It goes into an autonomous kind of a protective mode. So trauma is just the culmination of an individual's psychological and emotional inability to cope with the current event that is going on, whether that event takes the form of an ACE, which is like an early childhood experience, okay, like a child rape or something like that. If it takes place in terms of a sexual attack, if it takes place in terms of slavery, or there's a threat to an individual's life, in the process of psychological and emotional trauma, one of the telltale signs within the definition that is provided by the trauma manual is that the individual believes that the threat to their life is imminent. Okay, this is not just okay. Two guys having a fight, right?
Right.
This is someone having a gun to your head, or someone you believing that there is an imminent threat of death. And that
Hmm.
imminent threat of death precipitates an emotional response, it precipitates a psychological response. And when that response becomes overwhelming beyond an individual's ability to cope, then the result is trauma.
You know, so number one, thanks for that definition, right? And one of the things though that people struggle with when you just got finished defining what psychological trauma is, right? As an individual, and again, I can't speak to rape victims, anything like that, but a traumatic car
Yeah.
accident, something of that nature, or a near fall, or being in an airplane and all of a sudden the turbulence is too much, or there's a near accident or something of that nature. 9 times out of 10, most people think that this is something that they can just brush off. Okay, that I went through it. If I just think positive about it, I'll be okay. Can you speak to a little bit, because one of the things that we see today is that, and it's becoming more prevalent now, to be honest, that mental health is starting to really ratchet up in terms of people really trying to understand it and really saying that this is a major issue. But I don't think a lot of people really, when it comes to mental health or these issues, really play a lot of credence to it.
Let me give you an interesting statistic. Um, I mentioned in the last answer ACE. ACE is advanced or adverse childhood experiences. That is the largest bucket of trauma or causes of trauma for adults. Childhood trauma, childhood experiences, be it you are 5, 6, 7 years old and you are growing up in domestic violent home, regardless of whether that violence is perpetrated on you. You are not being beat as a child. You are not, back in the day, in my day, getting a whipping was just par for the course, right? That wasn't, these days it's traumatic and all that. I mean, back then your mother used to beat your ass if you did something wrong, right? Um,
In the store in front of everybody, and nobody did nothing.
Listen, and when
All
your
right.
father came home,
Oh, it
you're
was
going to get
done.
a
We
replay
finished.
of that. But but
Right.
but what I'm getting at is I'm not talking about corporal punishment. I'm not talking about just, you getting a whipping. I'm talking about you are growing up in a home where domestic violence is kind of the norm, right? Between your mom and dad or your stepmom and whoever your caregivers are, right? You are having that experience, or you are having experiences that are less desirable. For example, a childhood sexual abuse or something of that nature, or even being bullied as a child, right? Being neglected as a child, right? No physicality, right? You are just being told, shut up, you talk too much, go in the corner, be quiet. These are grown folks' conversations. What are you doing here? Go to your room. All those kinds of things that if you're a certain age, you grew up with and never really internalized, or at least you weren't aware that you were internalizing these things. All of these adverse childhood experiences impact adulthood and impact physical health, Chris. Heart attacks, high blood pressure, anxiety, depression, all of those physical illnesses, right, can be linked back to ACEs. That is the largest bucket. Now, you have other things happen as you growing up. I mean, you experience a death, a family passing. That's very traumatic. That is a bucket in psychology that affects a large population of people. Car accidents, as you cited, Tony, is a large bucket of events that precipitates trauma in adults, but by far the largest buckets are adverse childhood
ACE.
experiences.
Can I share a story?
Yeah,
Um, and this is reason I asked the question. So I fall into that bucket, the ACE bucket, right? However, I didn't know that I had psychological
absolutely,
trauma, and I was coping until I went to a therapist,
absolutely.
okay, about other issues, to be fair, right? And then all of a sudden, you find somebody that you really can chat with and you can open up to, and you don't feel that they'll judge you and stuff to that nature, right? And then all of a sudden, this situation happened when I was 9 years old. And I never knew that it affected me my whole life until it came out. And it was with my mother, where, I was a shy kid and I always wanted to please my mother. And this one day, we used to eat, which I can't stand, pork and beans. I'll never eat them the rest of my life. Okay. But my mother, she was doing the best she could. And I asked my mother what we was having for dinner. She said pork and beans and hot dogs. And I smiled at her. I said, okay, mom. And then I went into my room and I fell out in the closet. Oh, we got pork and beans. Hot dogs. And she ended up following me and she saw my outburst and she was upset. I'm doing the best I can, blah, 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 this and that. That was the last time for years I ever told somebody how I really felt about anything.
And Tony, I want to congratulate you as um, not just a black executive, but a black executive who would make such a confession publicly. Um, your confession is a beautiful thing because it opens the door for therapy. It opens the door to let people know that seeking help is okay. The African American general public, but in particular the African American males, are not brought up to seek therapy, right? Therapy is almost a bad word. But a lot of us have ACEs. And let me tell you, there's a book called um, The Body. The Body Tells the Story, or The Body Remembers. I forgot. The Body Knows, by Bessel van Kolk, Kolk. He is a premier psychiatrist up in Boston that has done tons and tons and tons and tons of research about this subject matter. And childhood trauma is linked in a high percentage. I'm talking about maybe 60+% of of this is why adults have problems. And I'm talking about not just latent problems that are hidden, that they themselves don't even realize this is why they have this reaction to this. This is why they are triggered. This is why they are experiencing this. This is why they look at things this way. Because Dr. Bessel says, he says that the after trauma, the mind experiences life anew. You do not experience life the same way post trauma as you do pre trauma, right? The body remembers, the body knows, right? And these are reactions from trauma, are not intentional reactions. They are automatic. They are independent of your intentionality, right? They are reactive. They are responsive, right? It's just how the body works. It's how the nervous system works, and this is the very essence of the reactions of trauma. And when you think about years and centuries of not just historical but intergenerational trauma, and concurrent trauma, and continuous everyday trauma, and racial trauma, and cultural trauma, and discriminatory trauma, when you look at the African American, and particularly the African American Black man or young man, you really got to unpack all of that. And when you begin to peel back that onion, you begin to understand more why that guy is that guy, or how that guy became that guy, or how that young lady became that young lady. And let me just stick a pin and say right away, trauma is not a black thing. It's
Right.
not a white thing. Trauma is a human thing, right? Most of the studies that have been done on intergenerational trauma or historic trauma was done on the Holocaust survivors, was done on Native Americans, was done on the Israelis and the Gazans, was done on the South African population. Because this is the thing, right? Tony, in your example, you are not the only one traumatized in that example. Your
No,
mom
that's
was
so true.
affected
My mother.
too.
Exactly. No question. And she carried that.
Yes.
She
Do,
carried
do,
that,
do, do,
that
do.
she thought she couldn't produce for her kids. Exactly.
You have kids. We all have kids. Can you imagine walking in your daughter's bedroom and seeing that and hearing her say that, knowing the sacrifices you make as a black executive, Okay, knowing and think about Tony's mom. Think about Mama, right? Who's just
Right.
doing the best she can in Detroit or wherever that situation
It was
was,
Detroit. It was
right?
Detroit. Yep.
In
Right.
Detroit, back in the 60s or 70s, right?
70s.
Back in the
70s.
70s, right? In the midst of the
Look, bro,
Black
don't
Power movement.
I'm aging well though, but don't try
Yeah,
to put
yeah.
another
I'm
10
just
years
saying.
on
Well,
me
I'm
real
a
fast.
60s baby, man.
I know,
You know what I
I'm
mean?
teasing. I'm
You
teasing.
know, but I'm just saying, think about her daily lived experiences. And I can give you the history of pork and beans in the black community, right? Particularly the history of pork, because it was the cheapest meat, still is, I believe,
Buddy,
right?
flat out. Flat out.
And when you go down south and you get on that chitlin circuit, I mean, we eat everything from the snout to the tail on the pig, including the blood. We make blood pudding with it, right? So we've got a history with pork and beans, my brother.
So here's the thing though. So here's the thing. And buddy, I'm really enjoying this. And I want to say what I want to say, then I want to back up a little bit because I want you talked about cultural, intergenerational. So I want you to at least define them so everybody's on the same page of what they
Yeah,
are, and then we can move forward. But putting a pin on what happened with me and my mother, right? And what you're saying, I just want to expand on this to the audience because to be fair, I would have never talked about this years ago,
right,
right? Number one, I didn't even know it was
right.
happening. I would always avoid talking about myself. And one of my biggest things that was a struggle was saying no, right? Because the time I said no to my mother in my way,
Mhm.
right, that I didn't really like that dinner that night, so, I got it thrown back in my face. So immediately to your point, the physical said, you don't like that feeling. So you're going to avoid anything that you got to come up with that's going to give you that feeling, right? So think about this catapult to being in corporate America in my early days, or having a relationship with my girlfriend, a wife, or whatever the case may be. When you can't speak and say what you really feel because of the fear of them coming back at you, how effective can you be? How can you build a relationship? How can you be successful in an environment that they're going to come back and tell you stuff all day long and you got to learn how to deal with it, but if you don't know how to speak up because of something that happened back when you were 9 years old and you have no clue about it until I went to therapy and flushed it out, you then what how do you think you feel about yourself when all these things start happening and you can't, defend yourself or really speak your mind the way that you should?
Yeah, well, let me just say this, Tony. I gave in the definition earlier about trauma that someone that's experiencing trauma has to have the element of an imminent threat of death or loss of life. And saying no to a Black mother is really borderline um, having an imminent threat of death. Okay. It's not something that you traditionally do. You don't say
That's
no,
why I
mom.
went to the back
Right. You
room.
know what I mean? So
Exactly.
yeah, but yeah, the fact of the matter is that once you get emotionally shut down and your body and your system and your emotions understands that, it affects what is called your worldview, right?
Mm,
Because the one of the issues with having a traumatic experience is that a traumatic experience alters your worldview. It alters how you see the world. It alters your sense of safety and your sense of who you are, right?
mm,
And when you have that altering experience psychologically and emotionally, it's very difficult to reverse that unless you begin to really understand it in therapy. And if your therapist is culturally sensitive, then your therapist will understand what questions to ask, how to navigate your experience, and what interventions you need in order to live a more fulfilled life uh, in adulthood. So
Right.
I'm glad you found the right person. But it all of these are illustrations of what happens to individuals, what happens to people, regardless of race, regardless of anything else. I mean, this is just a human experience, and the human experience of trauma is across the board. Now, when you interject the variable of race, then you begin to come up with other systemic problems,
Right.
right? So the more comorbidities that you interject in a problem is the more vulnerable that person will be to being affected by that problem, right?
Let me ask you this because I know Chris wants to chat about, he wants to play something that will speak directly to that, right? And
Mhm.
want to get your reaction to it. But just real quick, when we say cultural trauma, what do we mean?
Well, cultural trauma is, again, that overload of an individual's system because primarily of the cultural or ethnic population that they belong to.
Okay.
So let's take the Holocaust, right? It was a Jewish experience, right? And the experience occurred primarily because of their ethnicity, right? Because of who they were culturally, because of their experience with Judaism, right?
Hmm.
So Hitler and others decided that, hey, because of who you are, we will eliminate you, and sought to eliminate them, right? Now, when research has been done, and there is a wonderful researcher called Dr. Yoshida, who's done just loads of research about intergenerational trauma and using the Jewish population and using the Holocaust and using the effects of the Holocaust, not just on the survivors, but also on two generations beyond their survivors.
Mm.
So the survivors' children and their children's children. And there were clear signs, um, 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 empirical signs, meaning with data, with numbers, with based on research, right? That showed that cultural trauma has traveled through time and has landed two generations later. The Native Americans and the Trail of Tears, right? And that traumatic experience at Wounded Knee, right? That massacre that occurred. There are Native Americans have more substance abuse issues
Mm.
than any other ethnicity in the United States, right? Suicides um, is very high, um, 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 but substance abuse is really high. And substance abuse is one of the go tos of coping with trauma. Remember, my earlier definition said that when the emotion becomes overloaded and has an inability to cope with the situation, well, alcohol, drugs, etc., those are coping substances, right?
Right.
And that's what happens, and it can all link back to those negative experiences because of their culture, for no other reason than because
Right.
of their culture. So that's the bucket of
Let
cultural
me
trauma.
ask you this though, because we're not going to go as deep in this conversation with dissociative identity and things of that nature from a coping perspective. But the reality of a conditioned
Right.
response, right? And so when you grow up, I've heard plenty of people, my people say, we didn't know we was poor. We didn't know this, we didn't know that until exposure expanded the expectation, right? So great example. At one point in time, I was living somewhere and my mom came to visit from where we're from, and it was too quiet. She couldn't sleep well. She couldn't function. But it was just it wasn't enough movement because we was on a golf course, right? I felt like we had graduated to this point, but I felt so bad that she couldn't absorb it and embrace it and enjoy it because it was not what she was conditioned to being around. It was not enough going on. I, how do we? Is that a byproduct or?
Well, that's really similar to what the experts now call FOMO with regards to kids and their phones, the fear
Mhm,
of missing out. Right? My kids, whenever they come here
mhm,
from New York, right? My daughter, my youngest daughter, she's like 24 years old. She says, "Daddy, I can't sleep. It's just too
mhm.
quiet." She is, they live in Harlem. She's like, where's the
Right,
sirens
absolutely,
at? Like, where's the
absolutely.
ambulances? Right? But let me just say this, and this is important as a result of the question you bring up. Trauma only affects, and please forgive my use of the term only. Trauma affects 30% of the people who experience the same identical event.
Wow.
So 100 people experienced
Mhm,
COVID. Only 30 of them are going to have um, PTSD, depression, or some other sign of
mhm,
trauma.
Now,
Okay.
why is that?
That's just the statistics. That's just how the bell curve works. I mean, so Tony, you experienced what you um, experienced, and I may experience the same thing, and it didn't
mhm,
affect
Doesn't
me.
bother you.
And
Yeah, it
that's
doesn't bother.
that those are situations where you get into a lot of sibling rivalry because you got three brothers and the other two brothers is like, man, get a hold of yourself. You all
That's
corporate
me.
now,
That's me.
you going to
That's
therapy
me.
and stuff, and you just, man, come on, man. We lived in the same
Yeah.
household. Like, what the hell are you
Why you too
talking
good for
about?
pork and beans? Why you too
Okay.
He
good for
said
pork
the
and
same
beans?
thing
You
to
know
me.
what
Right.
I'm saying? You just
Right.
whitewash
Right.
up there
Absolutely.
in the ivory towers in New York, man. Get a
You
Absolutely.
hold of
bougie
yourself,
dude.
brother.
You
So that's what you got. And when you're dealing with everyday people who don't understand the intricacies, right? That three of us could experience the same event, but it will only affect one of us because that's the 30%. And both of us will be fine. Um, um, that doesn't mean it didn't happen to Tony.
That's
right,
deep.
right, right.
That doesn't mean we should cancel out his experience, right? And this whole thing about pulling yourself up by the bootstraps. Well, I mean, 30% of us ain't got no boots. Right? You understand? So we're still dealing with, and this happens in the black community all the time. Oh, y'all stop complaining. You giving reasons why. Now you coming up, Yusuf, with historical trauma, intergenerational trauma. My grandparents just worked hard, man. What are you talking about? Forget all that. Right?
Right.
So you get into these responses, right? Trying to, because these are individuals trying to explain your situation, right? And they are judging their situation, and they are doing an invalid, what we say in psychology, they are doing an invalid correlation between them and you, right?
Right,
That's not how trauma works.
right, right. That's excellent, my friend. I totally agree. So listen, we want to jump to some trauma um, that happens a lot to African American men. Okay, so we're gonna play a quick little clip, let you listen to it, and then I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Okay.
You get your ass blown the fuck out. Get the fuck out of here. Get the fuck out the fucking car. Damn, I didn't do anything. Turn your own fucking ass. Hey, I didn't turn your ass around. All right. On the ground. On the ground. All right. You don't do that, okay? Get on the fucking ground. Get on the ground. Okay. I'm gonna change your ass. All right. I'm on the ground. Lay down. Yes, sir. Get down. Please change on the ground. I think to tase you. Get on the ground. Lay down. One. Now. I tase him. All right. Okay. Break your shit. Okay, dude. Damn. Turn the fuck around. Put your fucking hands on your back. Bitch, put your hands on your back. Okay, stop. I'm gonna knock your ass the fuck out. You guys are really doing a lot right now. Bro, lay down. I'm just trying to go home. Man, if you don't lay down. I am on the ground. Put your hands on your stomach. I got you. Okay. Get the fuck back. Stop! I'm not doing it.
So, if you're not familiar, that's what happened in Memphis with Tyree Nichols when he was at a stoplight and the police pulled up behind him and then snatched him out of the car. And then, all that was recorded. And that is something, not 100% similar, but these are things, one of the things that people of color deal with when we talk about those types of situations. So I'd love to hear your thoughts when we talk about trauma, right? Especially when it comes to the police. Chris and I did an episode, Not to Protect and Serve, and we went through the history of the relationship between the police and the African American community, and why today we still, and I'll use your term when you just got finished talking about PTSD, we still have PTSD when we see police lights or they in our neighborhood or whatever the case may be.
And
Can you speak
let
a
me
little
just
bit to
add to
that?
this
Wow.
before you get too
Well,
deep
go
into
ahead,
that.
Chris.
Give me your impression, because I looked at your facial expression when the hyperaggression, the rage, and the fear was going on in that audio. And there are video, clips that accompany that, but just in the audio, I seen the despair in your expression. Can you walk me through kind of what you were going through while you were, exposed to that?
I never heard that before. That was my first time hearing that. And this is what you call vicarious trauma. What you saw in me. What you were witnessing was secondary trauma
Okay.
or
Okay.
secondhand trauma. Okay. Um, Clearly, Mr. Nichols, is that his
Yes,
last
sir.
name?
Correct.
Mr. Nichols is the primary um, victim of trauma here. And I'm calling him a victim because I don't think he
That is
survived the
correct.
experience. Did he
He did not.
survive it? Right. So he's not a survivor. So he's a victim here, right? So he's the primary victim. But there are other survivors of that traumatic experience. The police officers and first responders. They were traumatized or they experienced the event. And I've got to believe, based on the statistics I just gave earlier, that 1 out of 3 of them experienced trauma as a result of that experience that they went through. Okay, the first responders, the whoever the EMTs were, or the fire people, or whoever were called to the scene. These people experienced, listen, COVID laid bare the vulnerability of first responders. From suicides being committed by doctors and nurses and healthcare professionals, suicides being committed by nursing home professionals and EMS people who just couldn't take it anymore. The amount of first responders that are in therapy now as a result of COVID, only because they were experiencing, seeing so much death. So vicarious trauma, secondary trauma, or secondhand trauma is a real thing. The videographer, okay, whoever was recording this, and you and me who are listening to it or seeing the video or going on YouTube or seeing it in the media outlets, so a police incident is not just a police incident with that person, with that survivor. When these things go viral, these things affect the entire community, not just the African American community, but in the entire humanity. This is why you have marches and Black Lives Matter marches in Germany, okay, and Russia and Greece and Italy and all these places that are not predominantly non-Black or non-white people, right? Because humans sympathize and we empathize and we feel people's hurt, right? So what you were watching with me, listening to that clip, was just hurt, was pain, right? And that pain, a lot of times, manifests itself in very adverse ways and in very negative ways, with, like I said, 30% of the people who experience.
Wow, buddy. Thanks. And you're 100% right. Even listening to it over and over again, you feel that pain, right? You feel, and to be fair, I think Chris had talked about before where he didn't even want to, his wife said, you don't even want to watch this, or because it's going to be so, damning or negative to you, right? So, but that's the thing though, that we carry because of these issues. And let's be fair though, this happened last year in 2023, but we've been dealing with these issues for centuries,
Absolutely.
right? From lynchings to, and it's not even, and to the point where it doesn't even have to be physical. It can be just the presence of these individuals in our community or whatever the case may be, that all of a sudden we become shook. Speak to that a little bit.
Listen, every time a mother, a Black mother or a mother of color, warns her son to be careful, or be safe, or come home, or we tell our sons, don't try to be a hero, right? Don't wear that hoodie at night. I have 3 sons. I tell them, do not. I understand it's the style and all of that, man, but listen, this stuff can get you killed, right? That's trauma. That's my trauma speaking out. I'm scared.
Right.
I'm scared for my child. I'm scared for my son. That mother is scared for her child. And when the 3 of us on this show that are African American Black men, when we see the Christmas tree lights behind us, if we are honest, we tense up.
No question.
and we pull over, and we don't make no sudden moves, right? We don't reach in the glove compartment all of a sudden. If it's at night, we turn the house light on in the vehicle, right? We make sure that we are not being shifty. Those are traumatic responses. Those are traumatic responses because your mind is telling you that you are in danger and you are preparing to avoid the worst case scenario. That is you not making it back home to your family. So this is when you have a young man who has no police record, who is driving his car, he's going home, he works at the pizza shop, and his shift is over and he's just going home, right? He has no guns, no drugs, no record, no nothing. But he's 21 years old and he's driving home. He's black. He sees the police lights behind him. He pulls over and his intention, right? His intentional mind is telling him, be calm, be calm. But as soon as he sees that officer pull up behind him and open the car door and is walking towards him, something happens to that young man. He gets out the car, he starts running, gets shot in the back. Now, even black folk would say, well, why did he run? You know, he shouldn't have ran. Of course, white folks say he should have just listened to the officer and paid attention to the officer's instructions.
Or he must have been doing
Or he
something
must
wrong.
have been
He
doing
was a
something
criminal.
wrong.
He was high. That's the
Yeah,
go-to, right? Is that because why would the officer shoot him? All
right.
right. He had to do something wrong.
No one considers the confounding variable that young man is traumatized. And this is the message, hopefully, of this show, that we will begin to use other variables other than the narratives that are being pushed by the talking heads on TV and radio and all these different places, these sensational statements, right? Sound bites that come out, and that we consider our humanity. And we realize that, look, the Native Americans had a couple of terrible experiences, and look at what they're going through.
Right.
The Jewish community have had one major experience and a lot of microaggressive experiences, but one major, that's the Holocaust, that occurred in a specific space of time and length of time. The African American is so unique in his experience. 400 years. Now, if one experience in a sliver of time can result in the Jews having that effect from the Holocaust, or the Native Americans, or any other oppressed people, what do you think 400, not just 400 years of slavery or enslavement, but and Tony, PTSD is just an incorrect diagnosis, right? PTSD doesn't apply to us because PTSD assumes as is inherent in the definition, that this is a post-traumatic syndrome. This is something that happened as a result of this one event. You have PTSD. You went to Vietnam, you experienced some real bad shit. Now you came back, and every time a firecracker or you hear
Right.
fireworks go out off, you are triggered. This is not a one-time experience. So PTSD, which applies to singular traumatic events and a post-traumatic reaction from that event or response from that event, that's a correct diagnosis. But what the Black community have is continuous stress trauma, which is kind of what the Israelis and the Gazans have since 1948, because they are just continually, it has never stopped, right? It's like one ongoing traumatic experience. You had 6 wars, you have several incursions. The siren on the Israeli side is going off when Hamas hurls bombs. The sirens on the Gaza Strip is going off when Israelis respond, and it's back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Studies were done from these people, these groups of people, and the studies show that post-traumatic syndrome disorder just doesn't apply, because the injury is continuous and continual. With the African Americans in America, when you deal with the historic trauma, now you have to pile on top of that racial discriminatory trauma that is daily, right? From redlining to housing discrimination, to job discrimination, to access to health care discrimination, to police brutality, to on and on and on and on a daily basis, right? So now you have this young man who is in this car, who is driving home after his shift from the pizza parlor, and he's going, and the cops pull him over, right? You have a culmination of trauma building up in his lived experience. This is his lived experience, right? So he gets out and run because he blanks out.
Right.
Remember, trauma is the inability of your emotions to cope with the event. And some people's experience a traumatic event, and some people just faint. It's either you flee, or you freeze, or you faint, right? Or one of those responses. Some people just faint. Okay.
Let me ask you this.
Dude just ran.
Go ahead.
Let me
Go ahead,
state
Chris.
something though. As a historian, I think that sometimes we believe that success could be the absolution of trauma. And let's just use Frederick Douglass as an example. So Frederick Douglass was being taught how to read by a woman. You know the story, right, Malik? And yeah, he was being
Yes.
taught by a woman. They got caught. She got caught teaching him as a child, and then she was subsequently beat and raped in front of him. But because he became Frederick Douglass, that couldn't have been a trauma for him. But when you talked about 30% and things of that nature, and how people absorb and adjust, I still think that was a traumatic experience. Am I wrong in saying that? Just because he didn't materialize it as such?
No, the definition of trauma makes it a traumatic experience. The 30% and the 70% does not eliminate the experience. And so when I responded to you and told you what you were looking at with me was a trauma experience. I didn't mean that I was traumatized or I would have a lasting traumatic
Gotcha.
response to that
Gotcha.
experience, right? I'm not going to go out in Princeton now and start slapping white
I
people,
appreciate that. I
right?
appreciate that.
Right. So what I'm talking about is not the experience, but the response based on the experience. So that clearly was a traumatic experience for Frederick
Yeah.
Douglass. But if Frederick Douglass, and I'm just assuming that Frederick Douglass became resilient,
Yes.
and
Right.
We
his
don't know.
resilience, Black
Right.
people are some of the most resilient people on the
Right.
planet. And it is our resilience, our stubbornness, our persistence, our drive. That is one of our biggest, that's one of our best characteristics, is the fact that we are resilient. And the Black church and the Black culture has a lot to do with the very nature of our resilience, by the songs we sing, by the hip hop lyrics, by our historical Negro spirituals. These are things that has taught us resilience. The Palestinian people, the Quran, and their faith, right, has inspired resilience with them. And that resilience minimizes the effects of trauma or the reaction or the responses of trauma. So while Frederick Douglass might have been resilient, now we don't know his
Right.
life so
Right.
intricately that when he was
Right.
alone and at night, we don't know if he had nightmares about that. We don't know. We really don't
Right.
know, right? But from what we can see from the outside, right, we can say that he was resilient in I mean, the man ended up as the ambassador to the
Correct. Correct.
United
Correct.
States, right? So
Right.
so he clearly experienced
It's
some
interesting that
resilience.
you say that when you talked about going on a slapping tour, because I remember as a young child, my mom and my aunts talked about when they were young and they had viewed Roots on TV, Alex Haley's Roots, and how it made it difficult for them
Yes,
to
I
go to
remember.
school and fit in
I
and get
remember.
along
Yeah,
because of the emotion that it
yeah,
evoked as a historical cinematic pictorial
yeah.
and
Peace.
that's
Yeah.
different. Why do you think that as people of color and just people in general, we have to understand that, as you stated, trauma is all abound, especially for us as black males, black Americans. It's always there. It's how you deal with it or how you internalize it that tends to create the narrative.
Well, it's hmm. that's that statement is really tough, and I have to pause that statement. It's about how you deal with it. Um, that's kind of an
Okay.
oversimplification, right? Because let's go back to Tony again. Um, um, he wasn't dealing with it. Why? Because he wasn't even aware of it,
Correct.
right? A lot of times, your reactions from traumatic experience, you're not aware of it.
9 times out of 10, you don't
This
know.
is this is this is why um, older man, 30, 40 years old, can last week sue the parish priest where he came from because he had an adverse childhood experience that colored his entire life, but didn't link it together, right? Didn't really see the connection, right? There were no 10-year-olds suing the Catholic Church. I mean, there might have
Right.
been, but the fact is, these were all all adults. These were all adults. They were looking backwards to their time as children, to their time serving the church as an acolyte or whatever position, or just going to catechism, going for religious instruction. The fact of the matter is that a lot of traumatic experiences, number one, is not on the surface level. Trauma is described as an iceberg.
Mm-hmm.
Most of the reactions and the effect and the experience is beneath the surface.
No
Right.
question. No
So
question.
that's why I don't want to just concur with that statement, because that statement really doesn't incorporate the full aspects of trauma. Now, once we recognize that we have trauma or there is some experience, right? And we may not link it to a traumatic experience, but because the funny thing about people that are depressed is the large majority of them wouldn't even admit that they're depressed. They're just in their room in the dark, not going out, changing habits. They don't call their friends. They're just, you know what I mean? They don't even realize that their whole modus operandi has changed. Right?
So, hey, Malik,
Yeah.
so what, not there, but you make an excellent point, buddy. So for final thoughts, what do you want to leave the audience in terms of, because you took us from the beginning of trauma to all different type of levels of trauma, right? And all different type of experiences. And I know one of the things that we talked about before was that trauma, and you even spoke to it here, is not just about a black thing or a white thing. It's a people thing. So, for final thoughts, what do you want to leave the audience when it comes to trauma?
I want to leave the audience with the fact that we don't have to live with the adverse effects of trauma, that there is help out here, and there are coping strategies that can be incorporated into our daily lives that can make living with trauma much more doable. But you have to seek. You can't self-medicate or try to engage in substance misuse. But you've got to seek professional help. You've got to talk to somebody. And for those of us that are in the professional arena, that are engage in helping people. Maybe you are a social worker or a clinical professional, or something of that sort, and you work in the field as a counselor or something. Um, be aware of the adverse history of multiculturalism with regards to trauma. Be aware of the intergenerational nature of trauma that at least the research show, based on epigenetics, can go for 3 generations. Be aware when you deal with a black man or a black woman or a person of color, understand that drinking or that domestic violence or that youth that is incorrigible, just understand that bad behavior can find its roots in trauma, and not just because they're being stubborn or they don't want to listen, or hey, me and my wife is not getting along anymore. Those things may be the symptoms, right? But the real problem, a lot of times, like the iceberg, is hidden deep under, and it's your job as a clinical professional or as a mental health professional to go scuba diving and make sure you are treating the problem and not the symptom.
Buddy, I really appreciate that. This was awesome, my friend. I mean, we
Like
love to
I
have you come
talked too
back.
much.
No.
No, you educated today, my brother. All right. You definitely broke it down. And, you know, I learned a lot today, to be honest. Even the PTSD and all those type things and 3 out of 10. I mean, buddy, this was awesome. And I'm pretty sure our audience was fed as well. So, final question I have for you. How can a Black executive perspective help Malik Frederick?
Well, the Black executive perspective helps me every week. When I listen to these shows and I get educated and my cup runneth over, and so I want to thank you. I want to thank your technical audio guy, Double A, in the background. I want to thank Chris for his usual in-depth insights. I mean, you guys help me every week. Um, People, if they want to check out my website, they can go to www.traumapsych, and that's trauma psyc.com, all one word. And, there's some blogs on there, and there's some case studies that I've done from my PhD program. There's no subscription on all that. It's just an educational site. You can go on there, and if you want to leave me a note or something, I think there's a way to contact me on the site as well. So thank you so
Buddy,
much.
you being really modest. I've been to that site. It's got really good insights. And it'll definitely, especially for people who are listening today who want to learn more about it, Malik breaks it down. And then obviously, I'm pretty sure you're open to if somebody wanted to reach out and chat with you. I'm pretty sure you're
Yeah, yeah,
open to
yeah,
being able to
yeah.
do that as
I
well.
don't at this point. I mean, I don't have, I work a job, so I'm not in the clinical aspect of things. I mean, I am, a couple of months from my PhD, but I'm not like in the field. Maybe I'll get into that once I retire, but not at the moment. But always happy to help, give insights, and talk with people.
Well, thank you, my friend. I really appreciate you appearing on the Black Executive Perspective podcast. So I think it's time for
Tony's Tidbit.
Tony's Tidbit. So the tidbit today is by Alice Miller. And it basically speaks to what our guest today, Malik Frederick, walked us through. An unacknowledged trauma is like a wound that never heals over and may start to bleed again at any time. So we learned that today from Malik, but we also learned to be able to be on the lookout for individuals, try to understand the root issue that they may be dealing with. You may look at their symptoms and think something different, but most likely there's a root cause that they're dealing with. And a lot of times for all human beings, no matter what color, it can be from a traumatic experience. So again, I want to thank our guest, Malik Frederick, my Jersey man, right? I want to, give thoughts to my co-host, Chris P. Reed. And then obviously the guy around the background, Double A. I'm Tony Tidbit. You can follow a Black Executive Perspective podcast wherever you get your podcasts, and you can follow us on your socials at Black Exec on LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and X. Tony Tidbit, love you guys a lot, and we're signing out.
A Black Executive Perspective.